I want to show you something. This is my master's thesis. I wrote this in 2005 for Southern Christian University, now Amridge University. Been preaching on giving for 22 weeks now. I haven't so much as consulted this book so far, not even once. But there's enough source material in this book to produce 338 sermons on giving with new material in every one of them. That would be almost 7 years of material on giving, 7 years worth of sermons. Now, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm just about finished with everything that I have to say at the time about giving. I'm going to wrap up these lessons on giving before I go to Israel, and then I won't return to this topic for a good while. So after today, there'll be 2 more sermons on giving, and then when I return from Israel, I'll probably be wanting to preach on the things that I learned on that trip for a few weeks, and then we'll return to our studies in the book of Acts. But today I want to finish up my list of 10 reasons why I'm persuaded that Christians ought to tithe. Then next week, I want to just brush the surface of my studies on giving, which covers no fewer than 16 aspects of giving from a biblical perspective. 10 reasons why Christians ought to tithe. First, because giving in general and giving according to God's expectations in particular is woven into the warp and woof of the fabric of the Word of God from beginning to end, defining the Old Testament from Genesis with the sacrifice of Cain and Abel to Malachi and that prophet's admonitions about tithing, and defining the New Testament from Matthew, starting with the gifts of the Magi and ending in the book of Revelation with the tribute of the nations who will come and lay their tribute down at the Master's feet. Second, tithing is an eternal principle that was in place before the Old Covenant. It inhabits the Old Covenant. It inhabits the New Covenant. And it remains in evidence in the book of Revelation in the age to come after the New Covenant will have been fully consummated. Third, the tithe belongs to the Lord. That isn't a law, that's a fact. And facts aren't superseded by covenants. God is the creator of the world. He always has been and he always will be. That's a fact. God is love. He always has been and he always will be. That's a fact. And the tithe belongs to the Lord. It always has and it always will. And that's a fact. Fourth, tithing is a floor, not a ceiling. The Old Testament standard for giving was 22% of one's net worth on an annualized basis. The New Testament standard for giving in the earliest years of the church, though never commanded but universally accepted at the time, was 100% of one's net worth. But the standard commended to the church by the clear command of both Christ and the Apostle Paul was a simple tithe, one tithe, 10% of one's income assessed on a weekly basis. That's the lowest, fairest, simplest, most affordable, and most sustainable objective standard given to us anywhere in the Bible. Biblically speaking, it isn't a high mark. It isn't a goal. It isn't a stretch. Compared to the triple tithe of the Old Covenant, it's a walk in the park. And compared to the 100% standard of the first Christians that they imposed on themselves in the fervor of their faith, it's practically libertarian. And when we act like a simple tithe is a burden that's too heavy for us to bear, we show utter disregard for the cloud of witnesses whose faith is commended to us in Hebrews 11, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins and sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive the promise, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Fifth, Jesus commended tithing to his followers. Now, if you don't think that's accurate, if you don't think Jesus ever did that, I invite you to go online and listen to lessons number 218 and 219 in this series there before writing in to challenge me on that statement. You may be surprised what you hear. Sixth, the Apostle Paul commended tithing to the church. And again, if that strikes you as something you've never heard before, go and listen to my lesson from 3 weeks ago and 2 weeks ago before firing up your laptop to write an angry email, because my confidence in that statement has a solid biblical foundation. Seventh, Abraham, the avant courier of salvation by grace through faith, the father of the faithful par excellence, gave a tithe to Melchizedek. And that's an event that's recorded for us in Genesis 14, 17 through 24, and which is interpreted for us in Hebrews 7. This act of faith, this act of worship on the part of Abraham is to be received by us as an example for us to follow in the church for several reasons. A, because Abraham is the father of the faithful, and this act of faith predates the law of Moses by no less than 430 years. Tithing is not a product of the law. Moses didn't invent tithing any more than Ronald McDonald invented hamburgers. Accordingly, when we tithe, we are no more enslaving ourselves to the law of Moses than was Abraham when he tithed. Abraham is the father of the faithful, and he is to be our human exemplar when it comes to giving. He tithed, and so should we. B, that isn't just my opinion. That's the revelation given to us in Hebrews 7, where Abraham's tithe is commended to the church as proof of the legitimacy of Melchizedek, and by extension as proof of the legitimacy of the high priesthood of Christ. And see, Melchizedek isn't just any priest of God. He is an immortal priest of an eternal priesthood. According to Hebrews 7:3, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues as a priest forever. And the tabernacle in which he serves as priest isn't just any tabernacle, it's the perfect heavenly tabernacle, after which the tabernacle of Moses was designed, the tabernacle of heaven, where the blood of Jesus himself, the actual blood, his plasma, red cells, white cells, platelets, that carried oxygen to his brain and muscles and carbon dioxide to his lungs, was sprinkled on the mercy seat where God the Father actually dwells. Thus, according to the book of Hebrews, the covenant of which Melchizedek is a priest is the new covenant, the covenant of Christ. That's the covenant of which he is priest now, and that's the covenant of which he was priest when he encountered Abraham on the King's Dale, where Abraham, recognizing Melchizedek as a priest of the Most High God, received his blessing and gave him a tithe of all that he had. Which means that even though that event took place some 1,800 years before Christ, the tithe of Abraham was actually given in satisfaction of the new covenant. The tithe of Abraham wasn't an ancient rite, which serves merely as a type and shadow of the new covenant. No, the tithe of Abraham is a contemporary act of worship undertaken by our fellow believer in Old Testament times, but in service of the priesthood of the New Testament. And this is an important subtlety for us to apprehend. The other faithful things that Abraham did, and for which he is commended to us as the father of faith, such as leaving his father's tent and going to a land that God would show him, and being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac. Those were symbolic of the New Testament. That is, they were ensamples of the faith that we, as believers, would one day practice as the true children of Abraham. But the event that is reported to us in Genesis 14, 17 through 24 is different. Because for the space of those 89 words in the original Hebrew, for the duration of that hour on the king's dale, in communion with the priest of the heavenly tabernacle, built specifically to receive and sanctify the blood of the incarnate Christ, Abraham wasn't living in anticipation of the New Testament. He was participating in the New Testament. And the single act of worship in which he engaged during that blessed hour of communion with that heavenly priest of Christ himself was giving. And the gift that he gave wasn't just any gift. It wasn't just any amount given on a lark and chosen at random. And it certainly wasn't governed by his subjective sense of cheerfulness. Go and read the account. It's printed in your bulletin. Now, yes, I'm certain that Abraham was satisfied with the events of the day. He was, after all, returning victorious from the War of the Nine Kings, also known as the Battle of Siddim. And he knew that in that battle it was God who had given him victory. And for that he was grateful. But he was in no mood to celebrate. He was not light-hearted. In fact, he was downright disagreeable with his allies. When his fellow victors tried to get him to celebrate with them and offered him shares in their spoils, he refused, agreeing only to keep the food that his men had already eaten. What he gave to Melchizedek as a steward, priest of Christ, was neither motivated nor dictated by his mood. His gift was clearly prompted and informed by a thoroughly internalized sense of what it was that God expected of him. Abraham didn't tithe to make himself cheerful. He tithed because, as he understood the mind of God, that was the gift that seemed most appropriate to give under the circumstances. And the circumstances were that for the duration of his encounter with Melchizedek, he was in fellowship with Christ. And he alone recognized that fact. After all, in this war, Abraham wasn't on anyone's side but his own and his family's. You see, there were four kings: Chedorlaomer, Amraphel, Arioch, and Tidal, who had a small empire of sorts, and they kept the other smaller kingdoms in their territory in check. Well, the smaller kingdoms didn't much care for that, so the rulers of five of them, Bera, Birsha, Shinab, Shemeber, and the king of Bela, formed a rebel alliance and tried to overthrow the empire. But their rebellion failed. And in the process of putting down the rebellion, Chedorlaomer and his forces sacked Sodom and Gomorrah and took a number of their citizens captive, including Lot, Abraham's nephew. Well, Abraham wasn't involved in any of that nonsense. His kingdom was bigger than any of these others, and they tended to leave him alone. But when Lot was taken captive, that prompted Abraham to spring into action and go and rescue Lot and his family, which rescue he undertook pretty much on his own. Just him and 318 of his household servants. Now, his objective was simply to rescue Lot. But in the process of doing that, he thoroughly routed the imperial forces, chasing them all the way out of the region. And he freed everyone else too, including the rebel kings that had also been taken captive. But frankly, none of that really mattered to him. Bera, Bersha, Shinab, Shemeber, and the king of Bela, they were not his allies. They weren't his friends. They were a cadre of petty fools, one of whom, Bera, just happened to be the king of Sodom, where Lot and his family lived. Now, I think it's fair to ask why Lot lived in Sodom. I mean, in Genesis 13, just one chapter before this, when Abraham and Lot parted ways, Lot was every bit as rich and powerful as Abraham was. And when they divided up the land, Abraham gave Lot the better land. So there's no reason why Lot couldn't or shouldn't have been every bit as rich and powerful as Abraham was by now. But he wasn't. No, he had settled for being a prominent citizen in a city of fools. And Bera was his king. And after Abraham had rescued Lot, and they were all on their way home, what it looks to me like is that Bera and his fellow potentates, they're all kind of high-fiving each other like they had accomplished some great thing. They were trying to buddy up to Abraham. But they were not of the same caliber of man that Abraham was, and he basically wanted nothing to do with them. And the reason for this is clear when you read the account, because as they were returning home and they encountered Melchizedek on the King's Dale, just outside of Jerusalem, none of them recognized Melchizedek. They did not see what Abraham saw. Not even Lot saw what Abraham saw. And Melchizedek didn't bless them. And none of them gave a tithe to Melchizedek. Only Abraham did that. Because it was Abraham, and Abraham alone, who knew the Most High God, and who recognized Melchizedek as his priest. And he lived into that recognition by engaging in the one act of worship that meant the most to him. He didn't sing, he didn't read a holy text, he didn't pray. He gave. Specifically, he gave a tithe. And it was in that moment, and that hour on the King's Dale, that Abraham entered into a covenantal relationship with Christ through Melchizedek, which is the whole basis upon which the roll call of faith in Hebrews 11 even makes sense. Because the bond of brotherhood that the author of the book of Hebrews says binds us in solidarity with the faithful of the old is predicated on Abraham's encounter with Melchizedek. And that brings us to my next bullet point, and to the one after that, because eighth, we know that Christ was clearly in view in the transaction between Abraham and Melchizedek because of what it was that was exchanged in that transaction. Because Christ is our Passover lamb, a covenantal relationship that was codified at the Last Supper with the Lord's Supper, in which Christ took two elements of the Passover meal, the unleavened bread and the wine, and sanctified them, infusing them with grace, Eucharisteoing them, gracifying them, holding them in his hands, which were full of grace, and praying that his life substance, which is grace, would inhabit these elements, and that he gave them to his apostles to eat and drink. As Christ himself said in John 6:53 through 56, truly, truly I say to you, unless you eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink of his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats of my flesh and drinks of my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever eats of my flesh and drinks of my blood abides in me, and I in him. And because of this, every time we meet together for worship, we, as members of the royal priesthood of Christ, serve one another bread and wine, and so eat and drink the body and blood of our Passover lamb together. And of particular importance for today's lesson, when we do that, we always conclude that feast by taking a collection, by making an offering, which is exactly as it should be. After all, that is exactly what was done the first time the Lord's Supper was ever served. Because in Genesis 14, 400 or 500 years before the institution of the Passover, and 1800 years before the Lord's Supper, an immortal priest of Christ named Melchizedek left his station at the tabernacle of heaven, broke through the veil that shrouds the heavenly places from our view, descended to the King's Dale just outside of Jerusalem, set a table for Abraham, and waited there to intercept him as he returned from the War of the Nine Kings. And when Abraham saw him, he immediately recognized him for who he was, and immediately recognized that Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God. And Melchizedek blessed him and gave him bread and wine. Well, where did that bread come from? Did Melchizedek buy it at Kroger's? Where did the wine come from? From heaven. Where else? Now stop and think about that for 1 minute. Because if the priest of the heavenly tabernacle appeared to you and served you the bread of heaven and the wine of heaven, by what name would you call that serving of food and drink? What words would you use to describe that meal? What would you call such a feast? I know what I'd call it. I'd call it the Lord's Supper. And accordingly, I would not eat of that bread or drink of that wine without discerning the body and blood of Christ aright. And I also would not partake of that meal without making the proper response to it. I could not leave that table without making an appropriate offering in response to the blessing and the meal that I had just received, and neither could Abraham. The priest of the heavenly tabernacle appeared to Abraham, blessed him, and served him bread and wine, and the bread of heaven and the wine of heaven, and Abraham gave him a tithe of all that he had. Now, I don't know how Abraham was able to discern the body and blood of Christ from his standpoint some 1800 years prior to the actual event of the crucifixion. But I know that he did, because Jesus told the scribes and the Pharisees that very thing in John 8:56, when he said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." Maybe it was divinely revealed knowledge, imparted spontaneously by God, like what happened with Peter when Jesus' full identity was revealed to him in Matthew 16:15 through 17. And Jesus said to them, "But who do you say I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven." But I rather think that what happened to Abraham on the King's Dale that day was probably much like what happened to Cleopas and his wife Mary after their encounter with Christ on the road to Emmaus. Luke 24:30 through 31, when he was at the table with them, he broke the bread, blessed it. He took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, and their eyes were opened. They recognized him, A good many conservative Bible scholars affirm that the meal of which Cleopas and Mary were about to partake in Luke 24 was the Lord's Supper. And that the bread, the breaking of which caused their eyes to be opened, was the sanctified bread of the body of Christ. And I likewise am persuaded that Abraham's eyes were opened when he sat at table with Melchizedek and broke the bread of heaven with him. Because the bread and the wine that Melchizedek served to Abraham was the same sanctified host of which we partake every Sunday morning when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And I'm persuaded that Abraham's response to what he received at the hands of Melchizedek proves the point. Because when the children of Israel had witnessed the blessings of the body and the blood of the Passover lamb, the very next thing that the Lord commanded them to do was to pay the redemption price for the lives that have been redeemed by the blood of the Passover lamb. Likewise, when we, under the new covenant, witness the blessings of the body and the blood of our Passover lamb every week in the Lord's Supper, we respond by giving. Only we act like it's a coincidence. Like it's merely a matter of tradition and convenience, that the church, since time immemorial, has always responded to the Lord's Supper by giving. But it isn't. Our practice of following the Lord's Supper every week immediately with the offering was set forth for us by the Father of the Faithful some 4,000 years ago on the King's Dale, just outside Jerusalem, when Abraham responded to the same by giving a tithe of all that he had. Beloved, it isn't a coincidence or an accident that the offering is paired with the Lord's Supper. That pairing was made long, long ago on a hill far away. We don't give when we give by accident. We do it by design. And we shouldn't give what we give by accident either. All aspects of giving ought to be by design. And the model for what we give in response to the Lord's Supper was set for us by Abraham when he gave Melchizedek a tithe of all that he had. And people say that tithing is nowhere commended to the church in the New Testament. Balderdash. Ridiculous. Ninth, tithing is the first act of faith in the roll call of faith. Now, you're all familiar with the roll call of faith, that the body of Hebrews 11, where time after time faithful people of the Old Testament are named and their acts of faith are heralded. But the roll call of faith doesn't actually start in Hebrews 11. It actually starts in Hebrews 6:12, where the readers are directed to be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Now, chronologically, the most ancient person to be named in the roll call of faith is Abel, who's featured because of his good sacrifice that he brought to the Lord in Genesis 4. So in Hebrews 11, where the roll call of faith steps into high gear, giving is front and center, exactly where it ought to be. But while Abel's isn't the first name to be called, while Abel's is the first name to be called out in Hebrews 11, his is not the first name in the roll call. As I said a moment ago, the roll call actually begins in Hebrews 6. And ordinarily, Abraham's is the first name to be called out in the roll call of faith as it begins in chapter 7, and the act of faith for which he is commended is tithing. Now that has to mean something. That has to count for something, because tenth, according to Matthew 12:34, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And that doesn't just go for us, it goes for God as well. This is a pattern that you can see throughout the Bible. God doesn't hem-haw around. He gets right to the point. And whatever it is that's on his mind or on his heart, it's what he says right away when he starts talking. And I can show you dozens upon dozens of examples in the Bible where God's first order of business is giving. Now, I don't have time to develop that pattern for you in today's lesson. I'm not going to talk about it next week either. But I've preached on this before, and if you want to hear more about this phenomenon, I invite you to go online and listen to lesson number 19 in the Faithing series there. First things first. Don't worry, don't feel bad. You don't remember that lesson. It was only 15 years ago. For the purposes of today's lesson, let me just say that the fact that the first act of faith in the roll call of faith is tithing can't be a coincidence. God put it first because he wanted it first. God put it first because that's what he cared about most. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Beloved, those are the 10 reasons why I'm persuaded that Christians ought to tithe. And I find that list pretty compelling. And I hope you do too. And that is where we'll pick up next week. That's my lesson for today.